A call to action against crime in Detroit, making Detroit attractive to investors. A big change for Michigan's congressional delegation and a big move in state education reform. Stay put. MiWeek starts right now.
Recently, Michigan's economy has begun to turn around. Michigan's gained over 250,000 new jobs. We've paid off $20 billion in long-term debt. And our population is increasing for the first time in a decade. But to make Michigan a top 10 state, there's still plenty of work to be done. Step up and help put Michigan on top. Learn what you can do at MichiganTurnaroundPlan.com.
Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi there, and welcome to MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. The recent attack on a federal judge has placed the spotlight on crime in Detroit once again. Judge Terrance Berg wasn't shot because he was a judge. He was just another unfortunate victim of violence. The judge's family has urged the community not to blame Detroit for the shooting. So coming up, we will look at the fight against crime in the city. What has to change to make the streets safer? Plus, the new head of the DEGC talks about the best ways to sell Detroit to investors. Also, another longtime member of Michigan's congressional delegation is calling it quits. We're going to take a look at Candace Miller's impact on Capitol Hill. And Governor Snyder could make some big changes that would impact the Education Achievement Authority. It is all coming up for you on MiWeek. But we do start with the story that has the entire city and region talking. U.S. District Judge Terrance Berg was shot in the leg last week on his own front porch in northwest Detroit after he refused to let two young men enter his house. The judge is recovering after surgery, and the search continues for the two attackers. Meanwhile, the residents in the area packed a community meeting led by Detroit Police Chief James Craig this week to ask what can be done to keep the neighborhood safe. And that's where we begin our discussion with our MiWeek contributors Nolan Finley of the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, it's good to see you. When you heard the news of Judge Berg being shot, Nolan, what went through your mind?
Well, I mean, it's more newsworthy because he's a federal judge, but this isn't an unusual occurrence. There were 300 murders in the city last year, which was just shy of what New York City, a place that's, 10, 12 times as large as Detroit, they had about the same number of murders. We've got a culture of violence in this city that we have to get at. We have to deal with somehow. Too many guns in too many pockets of too many people who just don't care. And I think you could put a cop on every corner and not solve that problem. We've got to get at the bigger issue of why folks are so trigger happy here.
And why do you think that is?
I couldn't say, but I do think we've had sort of a lawless attitude in Detroit for so long that it's just become part of the mindset.
The police chief is working to change that, though, and reaching out to the community in a lot of various ways. But you still have community meetings this week where people are terribly concerned about maybe the random nature of what this crime was.
Yeah, well, and that's the that's the thing that scares people. It's that you can be in a relatively stable part of the city, which is where Judge Berg lives, going inside your house and two people come up on you and try to rob you. That's the kind of crime that you can't afford in a city that's claiming to be coming back, and this sort of exposes that gap between the narrative we're trying to craft about Detroit right now and the reality. That a lot of the things that we were trying to do and a lot of the efforts that are being made, particularly around crime, are working, but they are working in ways that are not going to be all that obvious to people who live here quite yet. Crime is down, but it is not down as significantly as it should be, and it is not down in neighborhoods like University District, which are very stable and still middle class, but are surrounded by much more desperate areas.
How impactful do you think it was, Nolan, that the family came out and said, "Don't blame Detroit for this"?
I think it was a nice gesture and a signal of their commitment. I don't think it has any impact at all. What people see is that, as Steve said, in one of our better neighborhoods, you're still not as safe as you might expect to be. And that does affect the mindset, not only the people who are living there and perhaps on the bubble, but folks who might say, well, maybe we'll venture away from downtown and considering housing and looking at some of the neighborhoods, which is where you need this thing to go. And I think it has an impact.
So how do you measure, I guess, success in the city? Because obviously you're not going to eradicate crime completely, and you've got to give James Craig some time to work things out. But Stephen, is there a time limit where you say, okay, this isn't working or this is working for the police chief?
It is working. It's just you're not going to take a city that had almost 400 murders a couple years ago and get it down to 200 or 100 in a year or two. I mean, it takes time, and crime is driven by a lot of things that the police chief has no control over. I mean, the desperate poverty and isolation that people feel in the city, the lack of opportunity, which we are still not really addressing. All of these things feed into the cycles of crime. That's not to say that all poor people become criminals. Of course not. But poverty is an accelerator for crime. And so until you start really shifting the focus to dealing with some of those things, you're not going to get but so far. I do think we'll get to a place where neighborhoods like University District are relatively safe like they are in other cities, but we're not even at that point yet in Detroit.
Real quick, trial run starting very soon with body cameras on 20 officers, Nolan, in the Detroit Police Department. What kind of impact do you think that's going to have?
Well, I think it's an offshoot, of course, of some of the problems you've seen across the nation. I think it'll give the police a little more confidence in their dealings with the public. I mean, there won't be any question about what happens in a counter, and it should give the public a little more confidence, too. I think it's a good move.
All right, turning now to Lansing, the search for a new state superintendent and the controversy about the Educational Achievement Authority. That state district that operates 15 of the lowest performing schools could now be moved from the oversight of the Department of Education to the Department of Management, Technology, and Budget. That department reports directly to the governor. All right, Nolan, so people are sitting at home and saying, well, why does it matter who reports to whom? What is the bigger move here at play?
Well, I mean, this shows the break between the governor and the elected school board, which is Democratic dominated and pretty much union controlled. And the governor's done with them. He's not going to go into Detroit and make all of these reforms and structural changes. We expect some pretty radical stuff coming out at the end of this month. He's not going to do it and have the Department of Education undermine him or meddle with it. So in taking this department, this office, out from under their control by executive order, he keeps them out of the process. But not only that, he has a vehicle to carry all of the other reforms he wants to do in Detroit, place them in this, and keep them away from the education department.
Is it wise to keep an elected school board that were elected by the people of the state of Michigan away from possibly one of the most important kind of reform districts that you have?
I don't think so. I think that sends the wrong signal about who's in control of our schools and who's in control of reform. I mean, we already have this issue with emergency managers displacing democratically elected officials around the state. That's a necessity that's built into our constitutional structure. This is really not. This is just this is an end around of the democratic process that I don't think is a great idea. Now, substantively, DOE has not been a partner in the reform the way it should have been with the governor, but this is not the way you deal with that.
Most states don't have this sort of setup where you have an independent state school board apart from the governor. The governor should set education agenda, and that we really don't need an elected state school board. We've got one.
But that's the system we have. Yeah.
And he's trying to work around it. When I think this was triggered by, he took a look at their finalists to replace Mike Flanagan as state school superintendent, and he wasn't too crazy in the mix. One of the leading candidates is Vicki Markovich out of the Oakland schools, who is a vocal opponent of charter schools and school choice. He's not going to work with somebody who runs that counter to his own agenda.
But I think that's a real mistake. Being against charter schools, being against choice is a reasonable position. It is not the position that the governor has. He needs, and there are a lot of
position for a state school superintendent
who
will have to oversee those the same as other schools.
But it is a reasonable part of the conversation. Not everybody is as enthusiastic about charters or choice as the governor is, and he needs to work within the democratic process to determine what policy should be taking into account those people who believe that.
He's not going to let the school teacher union set the agenda and block reform.
But the school teachers union is made up of school teachers.
I mean,
so now you're telling the people who have to enact these reforms that they should have no say in how the reforms unfold.
He is not going to have somebody sitting up there and subject his agenda to someone who's completely every day trying to subvert it. And this was a shot over the school board's bow saying, look, you go in this direction, I'm going to take more and more away from you through executive order.
You're going to have a real problem with teachers, ultimately, and that's not going to be a real problem in schools.
It's an Obama move.
All right, well, we're going to have to see where when and this executive order and where it leads us. Taking a look now at Detroit's economy, the new president and CEO of the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation sat down with us at the recent Detroit Policy Conference. Rodrick Miller says the key to growing jobs and investment in Detroit centers on how the city tells its story. Rodrick, thanks so much for joining us on MiWeek.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so the DEGC, investment and jobs. What kind of challenges have you faced in these first few months, half a year on the job?
Well, one of the things that's really critical to being able to drive new investment to the city is having a clear story. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people trying to control the story of Detroit, or I don't even know if they're trying to control it, but there are a lot of stories out there. We've got to have a cohesive message about our value proposition. So that's really been where a lot of effort has been focused on how do we tell our story most effectively so that it resonates with potential investors and that the value proposition is clear.
So what are some of the stories that you're encountering from people saying, oh, well, that's really what's happening in Detroit? What have you had to try to correct, I guess?
Well, one of the things is that the market recovery is not a real market recovery because it's just, a couple of people that have a lot of money and that there's not opportunities happening throughout the city. And that's just quite frankly not true. We've got a lot of investors all over the city and a lot of small businesses that are launching. There are things happening in the city. So, they're kind of the big names that everyone tends to focus on, but those are that's indicative of a bigger market reality, but there are things happening throughout the city, and I think that's one of the things that we've not done a good job at showing and highlighting a lot of these small and medium-sized businesses that have been in the city for a very long time that are making decisions to expand right now because they've got renewed confidence in the market.
When you guys are going around trying to sell Detroit to people, though, what are the legitimate hurdles that you think still stand in the way? What are the things that you have to talk people out of before they will come here?
Well, still there are big questions about the level of quality in terms of our ability to deliver from a government perspective. Is there transparency? Are there issues with corruption? Are there, and those
people are still asking those questions.
They're still asking those
What's
questions.
your answer?
The answer is that we've come a very long way and that there have been numerous things that the mayor has done in order to increase transparency in the city, and the results in terms of quality of city services is apparent. You're talking about moving from few hundred street lights to thousands of street lights in just a year. So those kinds of things show that the government is moving much more effectively, much more efficiently than they have. But those are real questions, and those are fair questions.
Do people ask you about the tax burden? We hear people talk about that it's harder for businesses here, and empirically that's true. But is that something that ever comes up?
It does come up, but I will tell you there are 10 other hurdles that come up before the tax burden.
Before that?
Yeah.
So, a lot of projects on the drawing board in Detroit. You've got the Joe Louis Arena project, Ford Auditorium, the big arena project. A lot of capacity is going to come into the system that you're going to have to fill. Is there the demand out there to fill all that space as it comes online in the next year or two or three?
Absolutely. For years, the city has really been underserved in terms of because it didn't have the capacity, and there were a lot of challenges that really kind of limited the ability of the market to perform. But the market is there, and I think Detroit has an exciting enough story and an exciting enough revitalization that companies will come and that events and conventions will come.
But Rod, we know that residential space is going and filling up. Office space looks pretty good, but there still seems to be a lot of retail space capacity that's going unfilled, particularly up and down Woodward and in the core of downtown. When are we going to start seeing retail?
Well, there's a couple of things that drives retail. One is that we always say retail follows rooftops. So you've got to have the population base, and there's still question about what's the capacity, what are the purchasing habits of the population that's moving in and taking up these kind of core corridors in downtown as well as up in Midtown. What are the spending habits? What are the things that this population really wants? That's still not clear to the marketplace, and that's part of what we have to do is define that story. The other thing that really is that drives national retailers is turnkey space. And we still have, even though we have spaces, they're not really turnkey yet.
What is the balance that you have between trying to attract a large national retailer and then also trying to cultivate a lot of these smaller businesses that are trying to, put a stake in downtown and be along that corridor that's starting to revitalize?
And so the reality is you need both. You need local small businesses that that provide that local flavor and culture, if you will, and you also need kind of national retailers to kind of ground the market, because if someone's coming in from out of town, they may not know the local shop, but they'll know the big national brand, and so that national brand really provides a level of stability that allows the local companies to be much more scalable. So we've got to figure out what's the right mix of that. Motor City Match is a great program that's just being launched. That's
the mayor talked about it in a State of the City address.
That's right, and I mean it's going to partner property owners with businesses, and I think that's going to be one of those things that can be catalytic. But one of the things is, as we do that, and that's really a local small business program, is to figure out how do we leverage even the activity happening there to bring in more national retailers.
You came from New Orleans and relocated here to Detroit for this job. What things have you, do you think, taken from your experience in New Orleans that you can put into play here in Detroit?
There are a lot of things. So one of the most important things is in terms of this economic progress and economic strategy, that it really has to be something that's bought into by all the layers of kind of society, whether it's the grassroots, the civic leaders, the business leaders, the political leaders. You need everybody really rowing in the same direction. If you don't do that, we would encounter a lot of friction. So I think one of the key things is making sure that this process of building our economy is one that's inclusive and allows opportunities for everyone. That's one. The other thing that I think is really, really important, the basics, is that the city has to be able to perform. When somebody goes for a permit and they go for a license, they need to know that this is the process and this is how long it takes. There needs to be clarity around our ability to deliver some of those basic services that companies look for in order to be able to make investments.
You're also talking about the jobs picture, and there's a clear link between development and jobs, but are there other things that DEGC is also interested in doing that you think will help improve employment for Detroit?
So it's very interesting that you say that. DEGC has been known for a very long time as a group that's very focused on the real estate development aspect. One of the things that we're really ramping up our capacity is our corporate attraction space. I think it's a huge faux pas not to have somebody on the road selling Detroit 200 days a year in competitor markets, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, Minneapolis. And so one of the things is that we're ramping up.
Saying to someone, move your company here.
Move your company here. And this is the competitive advantage of our market vis-a-vis your market.
Rodney, you got a lot of interest in downtown Detroit. A lot of folks wanting to come in, as you said, invest their money. What are you doing to make sure that the people who've been here a long time and struggled through the hard times here aren't getting sort of run over in this process and pushed out?
It's one of those interesting things. There's been this whole conversation about community benefits agreements and how do you ensure community benefits. There's some core principles in terms of how deals should be structured that really can ensure that. Number one, there needs to always be some sort of employment, threshold, and ideally there should be a local number in there. There should be clawback agreements and development agreements that say that if you don't perform, that there is the ability to claw back some portion of an incentive or anything that's. So those sorts of things really can kind of provide for that. And then last but not least, strong workforce development programs so that local people actually have the capacity to move into those jobs.
But what about the existing business people who've been occupying these spaces that weren't that hot, and so they weren't that expensive, and now they're much more in demand? What are you doing to protect them or to help them find other spaces?
Well, one of the things that's been very interesting is the New Economies Initiative partnered with the DGC, and we actually did a program where we gave out $10,000 grants and several $100,000 grants to businesses that have been holding that up. And I think more things like that are going to be really, really critical. And then also through our D2D program, we connected existing Detroit businesses to companies that would buy those services. And last year, we grew the spend from $550 million between Detroit businesses doing business to 810. So those kinds of things allow these companies to expand their marketplace locally.
All right, Rodrick Miller, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Turning to Washington now, Michigan Congresswoman Candace Miller made a surprise announcement last week. She's decided not to run for re-election next year. Miller says 14 years in the nation's capital is enough. She wants to come home to Michigan. Miller doesn't know what she's going to do next, but she wants to give back to the state. So could she possibly run for another statewide office? Let's start off first with this announcement, which was very surprising to me, Stephen.
Yeah, I talked to her this week and said, you're not 90 years old. You haven't been there for 40 years. What do you think you're doing leaving office? Because that has become the sort of standard, especially in Michigan, is that you get that job and you stay until you really can't anymore. And she said, you know, she went to Washington never thinking she would be there for the rest of her career, and that she felt like she'd done what she wanted to do. Was a little frustrated, I think, with the climate in Washington at this point, although not as frustrated as some other people have been, and just decided that it was time and that she could do other things.
I think that's what goes to show you that what kind of lawmaker she was. The fact that she said, you know, this is the job. I'm not entitled to be here year after year or ride it out until whenever. But, you know, she was a friend to the Great Lakes, Nolan, and she really got a lot of good things done and was a good moderate voice from this state, an experienced voice.
Candace Miller's a conservative, and she should make no mistake about that. She's a good conservative, and she was a good congressperson, particularly for Michigan. She was very much focused on her state. She never moved to Washington full time. She kept her roots here, her home here, and that's part of what's going on. Her family's here, her grandchildren, and if you've listened to her over the last few years, she's talked about, you know, this sort of being torn between Washington and here because she is so close to her family. I wasn't that shocked. I do think the way Republicans handle seniority in Congress a little different than Democrats. If you're a chairman or a subcommittee chairman, you only get 6 years and then you have to step back. You saw the same thing with Rogers and Dave Camp. You know, they really don't want to go back to Congress in a lesser role. So the Republicans do tend to move out a little more quickly than Democrats, who stay until their teeth fall out. So I'm not all that surprised by the move, but it is another very important congressman that we're losing from Michigan, and one who really understood the role. I mean, she didn't get Potomac fever. She was all about Michigan when she was in Washington.
All right, and she was also a very successful Secretary of State here in Michigan, which begs the question, she comes back, she's done with Congress. Is there a role for her now in state politics in some way, shape, or form, Steve?
Yeah, I don't know. I did ask her about that, and she said that she had nothing on her radar at this point. I mean, I think, frankly, the opportunity for her was last year with the open Senate seat in Michigan. She would have been a very competitive.
She doesn't want to go back to Washington.
Well, right. That's true. That would have been going back to the national stage, but that was, I think, that would have been a natural thing for her to try for. Obviously, she could run again for a statewide office here and would be a very competitive candidate, but she didn't sound to me like that was what she was thinking about. She was thinking about coming home, as Nolan said, being closer to her family, and she talked about some opportunities in the private sector, so maybe that's what she'll go do.
So no Candace Miller for governor?
Oh, I wouldn't rule that out at all, because she said several times, I'm not ruling anything out. When a politician says that, you can pretty much...
The door's wide open for anything.
Well,
right?
You can pretty much assure that they're thinking about it, and I think you'd have to consider her the front runner or among the front runners for the governor's race in 2018.
In 18, I don't even want to think about that yet. But we want to invite Fred. Come on out real quick, Fred. This is near the end of the show. We want to say a big thank you to the Michigan Association of Broadcasters for recognizing MiWeek and many of the programs here at Detroit Public Television with an Excellence Award. And look at that, it's see-through, so we could actually see your, there you go, we could actually see Susan's hand through that, so we got that last night.
To us.
There you go, so it's a nice recognition, and we appreciate
Congratulations
that.
to Christy.
Oh yeah, right, because I keep you guys in line. I deserve combat pay for that. That's going to do it for MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to continue our conversation right now online right after the show, so go to MiWeek.org for an extra segment you're not going to see on TV. We're also on Facebook and on Twitter during the week. Make sure you find us there. I'm Christy McDonald. For all of us at Detroit Public TV, we'll see you next week. Take care.